This is Moments of the Movement, Civil Rights and Change in America.
I'm Lonnie Bunch, founding director of the Smithsonian's National Museum of African American History and Culture. Welcome to Moments of the Movement. Junius Williams is heralded today as a noted attorney, musician, and educator who has been advocating for poor and working class African Americans in Newark, New Jersey for more than 40 years. He earned his reputation as a tireless organizer and activist after decades on the front line of the civil rights movement. But before all that, Junius Williams was a young boy growing up in a middle-class family in Richmond, Virginia. And it was then, despite his parents' fears, that he took his first steps towards becoming a full participant in the freedom movement.
I was born in Suffolk, Virginia, and my parents were music teachers. My father was the first black band director in Richmond, and my mother was the first coordinator of music in Norfolk, Virginia for schools. So they had a big musical impact on my life. My parents are Virginians. My father's from Danville, my mother's from Suffolk. We started school a little early because both my brother and I turned 5 in the later part of the year. So my mother talked the officials into letting us start when we were 4. So we were always a little younger than our peers. We already knew how to read, we already knew how to count, so that wasn't the issue. The issue was, should they have done it? And it didn't matter because she got us in there. Schools were segregated. She was a music teacher at the elementary schools, and my father was a music teacher in the high school level. So school was, for us, it was fun. We had a good time. There were challenging moments, but nothing to do with race, because we were insulated from that, from the impact of race, partially because of our parents' middle class standing, partially because of the skillful way in which they negotiated the system to keep us safe. The picture of Emmett Till sticks in my mind now, that open casket picture in Chicago when, 50,000 people filed by to see his bloated, disfigured body. I was a year younger, or maybe 2 years younger than Emmett Till, and I could just picture myself in that same situation. So we got mad. That was one of the sparks that really lit the civil rights movement in a lot of people's hearts, whether we did anything or not. And then there were some victories that we had also along the civil rights front of our own making. There was one, at a certain point, there was a festival called the Tobacco Festival Parade, because Richmond was a big tobacco town. They processed tobacco there. So it was usually segregated. The white bands were supposed to be in the front, the black bands in the back. Well, my father said, we're not going to march in the back. And the other music teacher at Walker said the same thing. Joe Kennedy, very prominent musician in his own right. And so we did. But at some point, they said, okay, we're going to integrate it. So there was this moment when we had 4 high schools, 2 white, 2 black, that were meeting at the gathering point in the west end of town, getting ready to march in the parade. There was Armstrong and Walker on 2 corners, and then across the street on the other were John Marshall and Thomas Jefferson. Those were the 2 main white schools. So, of course, the whites presumed to practice first, and they did it with the drummers. And the drummers were very rudimental, very sophisticated and polished rudimental drummers. But we laughed because we knew Armstrong's drummers were precise, but we had soul, and we kicked their butt. There lay dead one of the great rules of white supremacy, that they could do it better than we could. We saw it for ourselves, so we had a victory. That was our first civil rights victory in my family, because we talked about that forever. Charles Sherrod, who was the head of the black students up at Virginia Union University, led a series of demonstrations and sit-ins at the department stores downtown Richmond, Millen Roads, Tall Hammers, Kresge's. I'm not so sure where it was because I never got that close. I told my parents I wanted to join, and they said, "Oh no." The college students said they don't want any high school students involved. When I met Charles Sherrod, I asked him, "Was that true? Did you guys really say you didn't want high school students because we couldn't be nonviolent?" He said no. So that was just my mother and father's clever way of keeping me out of harm's way as they saw it. Little did they know. So they whisked me off to Amherst College in 1961, but the fire was still burning because I knew I had to do something because I couldn't just let everybody else do it, and I wasn't going to do it.
Yeah.
So eventually I was a part of the civil rights group there, and we were in support of civil rights, but at some point or another it was time for me to go south, so that's what happened in 1965. At some point after the Montgomery bus boycott, the lawsuit came about that said you got to integrate bus transportation throughout the South. So Richmond complied. So one day the word went out, the buses are now desegregated. So my parents got hold of the news and told Johnny and me, because they knew we were going to try it. They said, "Now when you get on that bus, I want you to be careful. Don't do this, don't do that." And I'm sure that was the conversation held in many homes around Richmond that day with black parents trying to protect us. So we got on the bus, and there was nobody seated in the front seats at all. And most of the older black people were still sitting in the back of the bus. So we sat down, and we were close enough to the driver so that I could see the color of his neck, which was red at that point. He wasn't too happy about this. And we started laughing and smiling amongst ourselves because we had done it. And it was the first time that the older black people who were on the bus, they smiled. They smiled at us because we had done something. I get a little emotional about that. We had done something they wanted to do for a long time. And so after the novelty wore off, which was within a couple of days, we all trooped back to the back of the bus where we could cut up like kids like to do. But it was a new relationship between us and the older people by that point. But probably after time went on, they still looked at us and told us to be quiet when we were getting too noisy. But just for that magic moment in time, we did something they couldn't do for themselves. And then gradually integration just kind of stole its way onto the public transportation system in Richmond. But my major thought was that I was going to go south and be in the movement and become a professional movement person, whatever that was. I wanted to be with SNCC. I wanted to be a SNCC field secretary. I wanted to organize people to do whatever had to be done at that particular time. So my parents put that idea in my head. And I remember they didn't want me to be a musician, but lawyers were fine. If I had wanted to be a doctor, they would have encouraged that too. But clearly I was not on the science math trip. So they said, "Well, why don't you become a lawyer?" And they kept pushing that program because they saw where I was going with the civil rights thing. I was telling them about things I was doing on campus. When I came home during spring break, I was doing voter registration in Richmond. I did voter registration in Springfield, Massachusetts, which was right around the corner from Amherst. I had this conference called the Civil Rights Movement Reform or Revolution. I and a group of others carried that conference out in this, I guess it was the winter of 1965. About 1,000 people came from all over the East Coast to that conference. So they saw where I was going. So why don't you be a lawyer? So I thought about it and I said, well, maybe so, but not now. I could see being a lawyer, being a civil rights lawyer, because I knew of the great civil rights lawyers in the Brown tradition. As a matter of fact, Oliver Hill was a neighbor, a good friend, became better friends after my mother passed. But he and she went to Howard at the same time. He was a law student and she was an undergraduate at Howard at the same time. And so living in Richmond, we went to the same church. So it was kind of like, there's a little story there, because one time we were talking, he said he was driving through Suffolk on the way to Norfolk to argue the case for equal pay for the teachers, and he got stopped by the police. And so he said the first person he called was my grandfather, Junius White, because he had to get somebody to vouch for him to get out of jail. And my grandfather was well respected as a businessman, churchman in the town. So the white people in charge said, if Junius White says he's okay, then we're gonna let him out on bail. They didn't know what he was doing, of course. They had no idea he was going down to try that case. Otherwise, Junius White or anybody couldn't have stopped him from keeping him. So that's the way that went. I wanted to be a lawyer because they wanted me to be a lawyer more than anything else. So this is what I said. I will apply to 2 law schools. If I get in one of those 2, I'll go. If not, I'm going south. So they said, okay. But they didn't understand the high stakes poker I was playing, because I only applied to Columbia and Yale. And I said, well, what the hell, if I get in there, I'll go. I was not going to spend all my time filling out forms for 7 law schools. And I didn't want to go to any of them anyway. And I got in.
Oral histories were conducted by the Southern Oral History Program in the Center for the Study of the American South at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill on behalf of the Smithsonian National Museum of African American History and Culture and the Library of Congress. Moments of the Movement, Civil Rights, and Change in America comes to you from New Visions, New Voices, expanding the American conversation because it's time to hear the difference. With support from the Corporation for Public Broadcasting. Visit us online at newvisionsnewvoices.org.